If you're keeping up with trucking news, you've probably heard about the new attempt to guarantee overtime pay for truckers. The Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act, or Got Truckers bill, was introduced earlier in November. So let's talk about it. I'm Caroline, your trucking business professor here at the Bobtail Help Desk, and my goal is to help your trucking business thrive. So if that sounds good to you, give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Okay, so what is the Got Truckers bill? The Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act, or Got Truckers Act, was introduced by U.S. Senators Alex Padilla, a Democrat of California, and Ed Markey, a Democrat of Massachusetts, together with U.S. Representatives Mark Takano, a Democrat from California, and Jeff Van Drew, a Republican from New Jersey, in early November. So what does this Got Truckers bill actually do? Well, it repeals part of the Fair Labor Standards Act that exempts truck drivers from overtime pay. This exemption was originally put in place to discourage truck drivers from driving too many hours. Critics of that exemption argue that more recent regulations regarding hours of service and ELDs make that exemption archaic. They also cite that the absence of overtime pay for drivers worsens the driver shortage and pushes experienced drivers out of the industry. The Got Truckers Act would lift the exemption for overtime pay for truck drivers in federal labor law and require carriers to pay drivers time and a half for every hour worked over 40 hours a week. And to give you an idea of what time and a half actually means, with no overtime pay, if you work 50 hours a week at $20 an hour, your weekly pay would be $1,000, right? 50 times 20. But with overtime pay, meaning time and a half, if you work 50 hours and you earn $20 an hour, you earn those $20 an hour for those first 40 hours, and then you earn $30 an hour, or 20 times 150%, for those additional 10 hours you worked. That would leave you with $1,100 or $100 more than you would have without overtime pay. Okay, so who supports this bill? Supporters of the Got Truckers bill include the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, or OIDA, the National Owner-Operator Association, the Truck Safety Coalition, and the Institute for Safer Trucking. That's a lot of supporters. These organizations are supporting this bill because they believe that higher compensation for company drivers will lead to an increase in compensation for all drivers. And trucking safety experts also cite research suggesting that increased driver pay leads to fewer crashes. Lifting this exemption was also recommended by the Department of Transportation in a 2022 supply chain assessment. We'll link that in the description below if you want more information on that. Okay, so who does not support the Got Truckers bill? Well, most notably, the American Trucking Associations, an industry association formed mainly by large carriers, oppose the bill. The ATA's president has been quoted as saying that this change would reduce drivers' paychecks and decimate trucking jobs. But how would this bill actually affect drivers? We're going to talk about local drivers first. These are the drivers that are the most likely to already be paid hourly. So company drivers with local routes, that means under 150 miles, are typically paid using an hourly wage, and this group of drivers would be the ones most impacted by the guaranteed overtime pay, or the most clearly impacted. Lifting the exemption would ensure that these drivers are paid time and a half for the hours they work over 40 hours a week. It's important to note that there are some carriers that actually already pay overtime to hourly drivers. Some carriers that have been known to provide overtime include Saia, Martin Brower, Kentucky Container Service, and World Connect Corp. Okay, let's talk about OTR drivers. A largely unanswered question remains: what does overtime pay mean for drivers paid by mileage, or CPM, cents per mile? Most OTR drivers are paid for the number of miles they run, not the hours worked. If the driver is detained at the pickup or drop-off location of a load for more than 2 hours, they are then paid an additional amount in the form of detention. Notably, the CPM model does not typically compensate drivers for time spent fueling, doing inspections, or stopping for breakdowns and repairs. And it still remains unclear how the Got Truckers bill would affect this compensation model. All right, finally, owner-operators. Owner-operators that are leased under another carrier's authority are typically paid a percentage of the line haul rate. And because these drivers own or lease their trucks and are paid as independent contractors instead of employees, they are considered exempt from federal labor standards and would not be affected by the changes to overtime pay rules. But what do all of these changes mean for small carriers? To get a sense of this, we had a conversation with Mike Ritzema, president of Superior Trucking Payroll Service, a personalized payroll service dedicated to supporting trucking families. In my conversation with Mike, we kind of went around in circles asking these questions to each other, but it does seem pretty clear that small fleet managers who hire drivers could be affected if their drivers are subject to federal labor standards. So if you have a driver on payroll, lifting the exemption for truck drivers would require you to pay them time and a half for hours worked over 40. Now, Mike did say that in the long run, the financial impacts of this policy on carriers would probably be largely neutral. Basically, what he said was trucking companies can do math, and if they're forced to pay overtime, they'll likely just reduce the baseline hourly rates to compensate for that additional cost. And his prediction did align with the ATA president's prediction that the bill would reduce driver paychecks. Mike also told us that the mileage-based compensation model would likely turn into an hourly or hybrid model that counts hours worked. Regardless of whether or not this law passes, though, it's still unclear how carriers are expected to pay for things like detention, downtime, per diem, nights away from home for drivers that are paid by the mile. As it stands, there really is no standard on the books, and the Got Truckers bill doesn't address those details. If you're finding this video useful, I do hope that you'll give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more trucking business knowledge. Okay, let's talk about the impacts on the larger trucking industry. So more than direct impact on payroll, what are going to be some of the impacts that we see if this becomes law? Now, lifting the overtime pay exemption is going to have different effects. We can't predict all of them, but we can take a guess. So first, if larger carriers do experience disruption or the chaos that the ATA president predicts, this could mean a shorter term lift in tender rejections and an increase in spot market rates. Maybe that's me being super optimistic, but would love to see it. This would provide a lot of needed relief for carriers working on the spot market who are experiencing the industry-wide slump. If you want to learn more about the cycles of the trucking industry and the spot market and how those things work, you can check out our other video on whether or not it's a good time to start a trucking business, and also check out our blog for the cycles of the trucking industry. If larger carriers do respond to the new legislation by reducing the number of hours that drivers can work or reducing that base pay, this is ultimately going to reduce pay for drivers, and it could push more drivers into going into business for themselves or out of the industry altogether. In my conversation with Mike, he brought up the possibility that this response could push drivers toward more unionization. Many drivers today do look back on that time decades ago when truck drivers were united and organized in the US through unionization. And in fact, the earnings of truck drivers decreased by 21% between 1973 and 1995, in part due to deunionization. The impacts widespread unionization would have on the trucking industry, though, is a topic for another video and probably many books. But you can learn more about the history of unionization in trucking by reading this really great article from FreightWaves. I will again put that in the description. Another scenario, and again, perhaps I'm being very optimistic, is that large carriers will demand higher rates per mile from shippers to compensate for the increased cost of doing business. This could lead to an increase in rates generally, like a rising tide that lifts all boats. But when I talked to Mike about this and suggested this, he reminded me that the rates are more dependent on market forces like truck capacity and freight volumes than on the cost pressures for carriers. Of course, it's impossible to predict exactly how the thousands of different industry players will respond to this legislation if passed. If the bill does become law, hopefully the regulatory agencies in trucking, the FMCSA and DOT, will provide guidelines on implementation and compliance to to clarify uncertainties. Of course, I always recommend staying as informed as you can. We recommend staying up to date with news in regards to this and other policies that can affect your trucking business. FreightWaves and Overdrive are great places to start. You can also learn a lot from Mike Ritzima's blog over on Superior Trucking Payroll Services website. You can also learn a lot about overtime for truckers and other payroll issues on Mike Ritzima's blog that's available on the Superior Trucking Payroll Service website. Of course, we recommend subscribing to the Bobtail Help Desk blog that will give you updates every week on different industry issues. Don't forget to join our Facebook group, the Bobtail Help Desk, where you can get access to Q&A sessions, events, and other resources to help your trucking business. Finally, if you have any feedback about the content that we put out into the universe, please give us a call, visit our website, and write to us at hello@bobtail.com. We would love to hear from you. And I'll see you in the next video.